They mistake my silence for submission, seeing only a porcelain doll whose signs were directed. But they forget I built their empire from raw data. I do not just count money. I make it evaporate without a trace. Tonight, Julian believes he is claiming his freedom in this luxury hotel, oblivious to the fact that I forged his golden cage 5 years ago. My name is Alara Vance, and if you looked at me standing in the shadows of the VIP lounge, you would see a woman blending perfectly into the beige and gold tapestry of the Obsidian Plaza Hotel. I stood motionless, a glass of untouched sparkling water in my hand, acting the part of the patient, waiting wife. But my eyes were sharp, trained on the polished brass doors of the private elevator across the lobby. The air here was cold, conditioned to a precise 68 degrees, smelling of expensive leather and the kind of silence that costs $1,000 a night. I watched my husband, Julian Thorne, step into that elevator. He did not look like a man burdened by the corporate crises he had complained about over breakfast. He looked lighter, younger, buzzing with an electric energy I had not seen directed at me in a decade. He was not alone, linked to his arm, laughing at something he whispered. Was Serena Kincaid? She was the cutthroat communications director for our main competitor, a woman who treated corporate espionage like a varsity sport. She was wearing a scarlet silk dress that I had considered buying 2 months ago but decided against because it lacked subtlety. On her, it was a declaration of war. I did not scream. I did not rush forward to claw at his face or demand an explanation. I simply glanced at my watch. It was 9:14 in the evening. I raised my phone, kept it low against my chest, and snapped a single photo through the frosted glass partition. The image was grainy, but the faces were clear enough for a judge to identify. This was not content for social media. This was ammunition. The betrayal tasted like metal in my mouth, mostly because it was so predictable. Only this morning, Julian had stood in our kitchen, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the microwave. He had looked me in the eye and told me he was flying to Chicago. He claimed Ethirus Dynamics was facing a supply chain breakdown that only he could fix. He said he would be gone for 3 days. I remembered the exact tilt of his head as he said goodbye. It was not a look of love, or even guilt. It was a look of pity mixed with arrogant triumph. The way a man looks at an old piece of furniture he plans to leave on the curb once his new sofa arrives. My phone vibrated, snapping me back to the present. A text message appeared on the screen, generated by the internal security system Julian was certain I could no longer access. It read simply, "Protocol violation at penthouse level." I almost smiled. The irony was a bitter pill. Julian was committing adultery in a hotel that belonged to a subsidiary company I had helped him acquire 3 years ago. I had structured the deal through a blind trust to hide assets from the regulators. He was cheating on me inside a building that, technically speaking, my financial wizardry had bought for him. Instead of taking the elevator up to confront them, I turned and walked to the marble reception desk. The concierge looked up, his smile professional and practiced. I slid a heavy black card across the counter. It was not a personal credit card. It was issued to an entity called the Vengeance Investment Fund. "I require a room," I said, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. "I need the suite directly across the atrium from the penthouse, and I need absolute privacy." 5 minutes later, I was in a room that mirrored theirs across the hollow center of the hotel. I did not pace the floor. I sat at the desk and opened my laptop. I had no intention of hacking the hotel cameras to watch them. I had too much self-respect for voyeurism. I was here for something far more permanent. I accessed a command terminal, my fingers flying over the keys to wake up a dormant piece of software I had buried deep within the Ethirus Dynamics servers 6 months ago. Julian thought this night was about the pleasure of the flesh and the thrill of deception. He had no idea that while he was busy feeling like a king, I was about to activate the kill switch on the kingdom he had built on my back. To understand why I sat in that hotel room with such terrifying calm, you have to peel back the layers of designer silk and look at where I really came from. 15 years ago, I was not a wealthy executive. I was a ghost haunting the crumbling remains of the Ohio Rust Belt. I grew up in a town where the primary industries were unemployment and despair, in a house that vibrated with the snores of a father who drank away his miner's pension before noon. We were always drowning in debt, the kind that feels like a physical weight on your chest, making every breath a struggle. I was never the girl who stopped traffic with her beauty. I was invisible to the boys who chased cheerleaders, and I preferred it that way. While other girls learned how to apply eyeliner, I was discovering that I had a supernatural affinity for numbers. Mathematics was my escape. It was clean, logical, and it never lied. By the time I was 18, I was the only person in our decaying neighborhood who knew how to exploit loopholes in the local tax codes. I helped families keep the roofs over their heads when the banks came knocking. I learned early that the law is not a wall, but a fence, and if you are smart enough, you can find the loose planks. That poverty instilled in me a pathological need for financial safety. I swore to myself that I would never, ever let my fate depend on the generosity or mercy of another human being. I would build my own fortress. I met Julian at the university. He was a medical student with hair like spun gold and a head full of revolutionary ideas. But he had the financial literacy of a toddler. He was drowning in student loans and could not balance a checkbook, let alone manage a startup budget. He was drawn to me not for my warmth, but for my utility. He saw the way I organized my life, the ruthless efficiency with which I managed my meager scholarship funds. He called me the brain behind his smile, a compliment that felt like love back then, but sounds like ownership now. I made sacrifices that make me nauseous to think about today. I walked away from a fully funded doctoral program in applied mathematics to work 3 different shifts as a waitress and a night janitor. I needed cash, liquid and fast, to keep Julian fed and focused. Every dollar I saved went into filing the first patent for what would eventually become Ethirus Dynamics. I paid for the fees with crumpled bills that smelled of diner grease. We built the company in a freezing garage that leaked every time it rained. While Julian practiced his pitch in the mirror, I was the one writing the business plans. When the banks laughed at us because we had no collateral, I did what had to be done. I realized that the truth was a flexible concept in finance. I fabricated feasibility reports. I inflated our projected assets just enough to pass the risk algorithms. It was a gray area, morally speaking, but I told myself it was necessary survival. I built the foundation of our legitimacy on a lie, and Julian was happy to stand on it. As Ethirus began to rise, so did Julian. The media loved him. He was the golden boy, the young entrepreneur of the year, the visionary genius. I retreated into the shadows, taking the title of Chief Financial Officer. It was a role that required silence, and I gave it willingly. But then I started to notice the subtle shifts in his narrative. In interviews, he began to use the word I instead of we. He recounted the struggles of the garage days as if he had been alone, erasing my double shifts and my forged documents from the history books. He thought that by pushing me out of the spotlight, he was rendering me powerless. He was an idiot. By leaving me in the shadows, he left me alone with the books. He forgot that while he was busy shaking hands and posing for magazine covers, I was the one constructing the labyrinth. I was the only person on Earth who understood the complex web of shell companies and offshore tax structures that actually held Ethirus together. He owned the fame, but I owned the secrets. And in the world of high finance, secrets are the only currency that matters. Ethirus Dynamics did not just grow, it mutated. We became a unicorn startup, that mythical creature of the tech world, hurtling toward an initial public offering with a valuation hovering around $4 billion. But as the bank account swelled, the air in our home grew thin. Julian started wearing suits that cost more than my father made in a decade. He hired image consultants who looked at me like I was a stain on a silk tie. Then came the demand. He wanted me to step down as chief financial officer. He framed it as a necessity for the shareholders. He sat me down and said, "Alara, the investors need to see a face with Wall Street grit, not the CEO's wife. It looks amateur." He suggested I take over the charitable foundation. a role that was essentially a glorified party planner for tax write-offs. I looked at the man I had scrubbed toilets to support, and I nodded. I played the part of the supportive spouse, but paranoia is a useful survival skill. When I handed over my official keys, I did not tell him that I had retained a back door. I kept my admin root access to the company's cloud data, a digital ghost key he never bothered to check for. That was when Serena Kincaid slithered into our lives. She was brought on as the strategic consultant for the IPO. She was younger, sharper, and she did not bother to hide her ambition or her attraction to my husband. She would sit in our living room during strategy meetings, leaning so close to Julian that I could smell her perfume from the doorway. She laughed too loud at his jokes and touched his arm with a familiarity that made my skin crawl, while they flirted over projections. I watched the numbers from my secret vantage point. I began to notice strange hemorrhages in the ledger. Massive sums were being funneled into a category labeled Research and Development, but the destination accounts were not labs or universities. They were offshore entities in jurisdictions where questions are never asked. Julian began to prune my life like a bonsai tree. My old friends were no longer invited to dinners. The loyal employees who remembered the garage days were slowly fired or transferred to satellite offices, replaced by sycophants who laughed at Julian's cruelty and called it visionary. I was being isolated, wrapped in cotton wool and shoved into a corner. The suffocation turned to panic one rainy Tuesday night. I was walking past Julian's study and heard his voice, low and urgent. He was on speakerphone with his personal attorney. I froze. He was talking about restructuring premarital assets and, more chillingly, eliminating bad debt. It was the tone that stopped my heart. It was clinical, detached. That night, I logged in. I dug deeper than I ever had before. I found what he meant by bad debt. Julian was not just hiding money. He was hiding failure. The clinical trials for our flagship drug were failing, causing severe side effects that had been scrubbed from the official reports. But the true horror was where he was hiding this toxic data. He was dumping the debt and the fraudulent liability into a shell company called Janus Holdings. My hands shook as I opened the incorporation documents for Janus Holdings. There, on the line for the legal principal and sole liability holder, was my name. It was not just betrayal. It was a setup. Julian was not just cheating on me. He was preparing to sacrifice me. Once the IPO launched and the fraud was inevitably discovered, I would be the one facing federal prison while he walked away with billions. I was not his partner anymore. I was his scapegoat. 3 weeks before the night at the Obsidian Plaza, I stopped being a wife and became an auditor. I initiated a forensic deep dive that would have made the IRS weep with envy. I knew my own access, while powerful, had blind spots regarding the external accounts. So I reached out to Silas. He was a former student of mine from my brief stint as a teaching assistant, a brilliant kid who had turned his talent for pattern recognition into a career as a white-hat hacker. I paid him in cold, hard cash and gave him one instruction: follow the silence. I wanted to know where the money went when it disappeared from the Aetherius ledgers. Silas worked fast. Within 48 hours, he had traced the funds through a labyrinth of tumblers and crypto wallets that Julian believed were untraceable. But the money was just the symptom. The disease was in the data. What we found in the unencrypted backups of the clinical trials made my blood run cold. The flagship drug, the one Aetherius was valuing at $2 billion, was not a miracle cure. It was a poison. The trial data showed a 30% rate of severe cardiac failure in test subjects, a statistic Julian had systematically erased and replaced with fabricated numbers showing perfect efficacy. Then I found the gun he planned to use to shoot me. Buried in the compliance folders were the submission reports for the Food and Drug Administration. At the bottom of every fraudulent document, certifying the accuracy of the fake data, was my digital signature. Julian had not just used my name, he had forged my cryptographic key. He was setting me up to take the fall for massive federal fraud. The picture became complete when I hacked into his personal cloud storage. I found a draft folder containing divorce papers dated for 3 days after the initial public offering. His plan was brutally simple: launch the IPO, cash out his stock options, divorce me, and leave me with the debt, the failing company, and the looming criminal investigation. He even had a non-disclosure agreement drafted for me to sign, tied to a pitiful settlement of $500,000. The wording of the agreement was a trap. By signing it to get the money, I would have legally admitted to having prior knowledge of the company operations, effectively signing my own confession. Fear is a useless emotion in finance. I replaced it with strategy. I initiated what I called the Ouroboros strategy, named after the snake eating its own tail. Over the years, I had quietly amassed a significant personal fortune through high-risk algorithmic trading, hiding it under the guise of an inheritance from a non-existent grandmother. I used this capital to establish an anonymous distressed asset fund. Through this fund, I began buying up Ethereum Dynamics debt. The banks, worried about the company's burn rate, were happy to sell the loans at 60 cents on the dollar. They had no idea the buyer was the CFO of the company itself. But the kill shot was something far more bureaucratic. I dug into the archives of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I pulled the original filing for the core algorithm that powered our drug discovery platform. It was the heart of the company, the single asset that justified the multi-billion-dollar valuation. I stared at the document and smiled for the first time in weeks. 10 years ago, in the chaos of our early days, there had been a filing error. The assignment of rights from inventor to corporation had been rejected due to a missing signature, and Julian, in his arrogance, had never followed up to correct it. The patent was not owned by Ethereum Dynamics. It was still owned by Ilara Vance. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating the dossier I had compiled. It was 500 pages of destruction. I had the proof of fraud, the proof of forgery, the debt ownership papers, and the patent title. I was not just going to divorce Julian. I was going to detonate the ground he stood on. I was going to halt the IPO, bankrupt the company, and send him to prison for a very long time. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for him to walk into the hotel and think he had won. The week before the implosion was a masterclass in theater. Julian decided to throw a surprise birthday party for me at our estate, an event designed entirely for his public image rather than my celebration. The living room was filled with white lilies, my least favorite flower, but they looked excellent in the photographs taken by the press he had invited. Julian stood in the center of the room, raising a glass of vintage champagne, toasting to my grace and patience. It was a perfect performance. I stood by his side, smiling until my facial muscles ached, playing the role of the adoring, supportive wife. But every time he pulled me close for a photo, I could feel the vibration of his phone in his pocket. He was texting Serena under the dinner table, likely mocking the very woman he was pretending to honor. He presented me with a gift, a diamond necklace that glittered violently under the chandelier. The guests gasped at his generosity. I let him fasten the cold metal around my neck, fighting the urge to shudder. I knew exactly where the money for this jewelry had come from. It was not from his salary or his dividends. It was a kickback from a construction firm he had hired to build our new headquarters, a firm that was using substandard steel to save costs. I was wearing a felony around my neck, and he thought I was dazzled by the carat weight. Then the whispers started. I watched Julian move from group to group, his expression grave and concerned. He was planting seeds. He told our oldest friends that I was struggling, that the pressure of the upcoming public offering was getting to me, and that I had become paranoid and delusional. He was painting a carefully constructed picture of a woman on the verge of a breakdown to explain why he would soon need to take control of everything. I decided to help him hold the brush. I deliberately dropped a crystal flute, letting it shatter on the marble floor. I stared at the shards with wide, terrified eyes, apologizing frantically to no one in particular. I saw Julian exchange a satisfied look with his lawyer. He thought his gaslighting was working. He thought I was cracking. 2 days later, Serena came to the house. She sat on my velvet sofa, drinking my tea, pretending to be a concerned friend. She reached out and touched my hand, her voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. She told me I looked exhausted. She suggested I skip the IPO launch and check into a private wellness center in the mountains. It was a beautiful place, she said, with no phone reception and strict isolation protocols. They wanted to lock me away while they stole my life. I nodded meekly, wiping away a fake tear. I did not tell her that the brooch on my lapel was a high-fidelity listening device. In her arrogance, she slipped. She mentioned that the facility payments could be handled directly from the Zurich accounts, so there would be no paper trail. She had just confirmed the location of the hidden assets on tape. The end game approached when Julian brought a stack of documents to my bedside. He called them administrative formalities, just standard updates for the board. I scanned them. Buried in the legalese were clauses that stripped me of my voting rights and granted him full power of attorney over my personal finances. I looked at him, my hands trembling just enough to sell the act. I took the pen he offered, but I did not sign with it. I dropped it, clumsy from my feigned nerves, and pulled a nearly identical pen from my nightstand. It was filled with thermal ink that would vanish completely within 48 hours. I signed every page, effectively signing nothing. While he slept the sleep of the righteous, I was moving my real wealth. I liquidated my secret crypto holdings and transferred the funds into physical gold and cold storage wallets that no court order could freeze. The final scene happened the morning before he left for the hotel. He stood at the foot of our bed and told me I was banned from the IPO ceremony. He said I was too unstable, that the flashing lights would trigger an episode, and for the sake of the company stock price, I had to stay home. I threw myself onto the pillows and wailed, begging him not to leave me behind. I let him see a broken, pathetic woman. He patted my head with that same sickening pity, told me to rest, and walked out the door. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, I sat up and dried my eyes. The performance was over. It was time for the execution. Back at the Obsidian Plaza, the air in the hallways hummed with a silence that felt heavy and electric. While Julian and Serena were undoubtedly clinking crystal glasses in the penthouse, celebrating a victory they had not yet won, I was 2 floors below ground level. I was not there to catch them in bed. I was there to perform surgery on the digital heart of the hotel. Because of Julian's extreme paranoia, he had insisted that a redundant backup server for Aetherius Dynamics be physically housed in the hotel's secure data center, a property he believed he fully controlled. He thought it was a fortress, but he forgot that I had designed the drawbridge. I stood before the reinforced steel door of the server room. In my hand was a white plastic security badge, scuffed and faded. It was from the transition period 3 years ago, a card I was supposed to have shredded. I held my breath and tapped it against the reader. The light blinked green. I slipped inside, the roar of the cooling fans instantly swallowing the sound of my heels. I located the server rack labeled with the Aetherius serial numbers. I plugged my laptop directly into the terminal, bypassing the remote firewalls entirely. My fingers moved with a muscle memory born of desperation. I accessed the presentation file Julian was scheduled to broadcast to the world the next morning. It was a slick deck of slides promising revolution and profit. I did not delete it. Instead, I replaced the core data files. I embedded the raw, unredacted toxicology reports directly into his graphics. When he clicked to show the efficacy chart, the world would see the liver failure rates instead. Next came the money. I accessed the automated payment protocols. Julian had set up a hidden transfer to move $5 million into a shell account for Serena as a bonus for her services. I rewrote the routing number. The moment he authorized that transfer, the money would not go to the Cayman Islands. It would go directly into an escrow account controlled by the Securities and Exchange Commission, flagged with a memo that read, "Voluntary restitution for fraud." Suddenly, the heavy door clicked. I yanked the cable free and scanned the room. There was nowhere to go. The footsteps were heavy, military-grade boots on concrete. It was Julian's private security detail performing a sweep. I threw myself behind a stack of unused hardware crates, squeezing my body into the dark gap between the metal and the wall. The dust choked me, and for a second, I was not a woman in a designer suit. I was a 7-year-old girl hiding in the crawlspace under our porch while the debt collectors pounded on the front door, terrified that my breathing would give me away. The beam of a flashlight swept over the crates, missing my shoe by an inch. The guard grunted something into his radio about the sector being clear and walked out. I waited until the door latched before I exhaled. I was about to leave when I noticed a direct audio feed blinking on the console. The server room monitored the penthouse security microphones. I put on a headset, needing to confirm they were distracted. What I heard froze the blood in my veins. They were not having sex. They were plotting. If she drags out the divorce proceedings, it could spook the institutional investors, Serena said, her voice tinny through the speakers. Then we make sure she cannot drag it out, Julian replied, his tone terrifyingly casual. The brakes on her car are old. Accidents happen on those winding roads near the cliffside. It would be a tragedy. Of course. I took the headset off, my hands trembling violently. This was no longer just about money or betrayal. This was a conspiracy to commit murder. The last shred of mercy I held for the father of my company evaporated in that cold basement. I was not just going to ruin him. I was going to annihilate him. I pulled out my burner phone. I typed a message to Julian's personal number, routing it through 3 different foreign servers. It read, "I know what you did with the clinical data last summer." I watched the server log. Up in the penthouse, Julian's phone pinged. I could imagine the color draining from his face, his eyes darting around the room, suspecting a mole in his staff, never suspecting the wife he planned to kill. I slipped out of the server room and took the service elevator up to the penthouse floor. The hallway was empty. I walked to the mahogany double doors of their suite. I did not knock. I simply slid a thick cream-colored envelope under the door. Inside was the divorce petition, drafted not by a lawyer, but by me, citing irreconcilable differences and forensic fraud. I turned and walked away, my heels silent on the plush carpet, vanishing like a ghost before the scream of rage could erupt from behind the door. The morning of the initial public offering arrived with the kind of aggressive sunshine that usually heralds a disaster. Julian woke up in the penthouse, presumably hungover from his premature celebration. He found the cream-colored envelope I had slid under the door, but in a twist of fate that I found deeply amusing. He did not open it. He assumed it was just another briefing document from his assistants, tossing it onto the pile of luggage to be dealt with later. He was too busy admiring his reflection in the mirror to realize he was holding his own execution warrant. He did, however, find the time to call our house phone. He wanted to make sure I was staying put, playing the role of the weeping, discarded wife. The housekeeper, a woman I had tipped generously before leaving, delivered the news. "Madam is gone, sir. Her closet is empty." And she took the cat. I can only imagine the knot of anxiety that tightened in his stomach. He hated that cat, mostly because it was a better judge of character than he was. Julian turned to Serena, his panic rising, but she waved him off with a laugh. She told him I was just throwing a tantrum, making a scene to get attention. She said I was harmless, a toothless tiger trying to roar. It is amazing how comforting a lie can be when it is exactly what you want to hear. The grand ballroom of the convention center was packed. There were 300 reporters, investors representing billions of dollars in capital, and enough cameras to film a blockbuster movie. Julian stood on the stage, bathed in a spotlight that cost more than my parents' house. He looked like a god. Then the double doors at the back of the room swung open with a heavy, ominous thud. I did not enter wearing a hospital gown or looking like the nervous breakdown victim they had painted me to be. I was wearing a midnight blue Armani suit, tailored so sharply it could cut glass. It was the most expensive piece of clothing I had ever purchased, and it was worth every penny. I was not alone. Flanking me was a phalanx of attorneys from the one law firm Julian feared the most, sharks who smelled blood in the water. Behind them walked 4 grim-faced individuals showing badges that did not belong to private security. 2 were from the Food and Drug Administration, and 2 were from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Julian spotted me from the podium. His industrial-grade smile froze, twitching at the corners like a glitching screen. He leaned into his microphone, covering it with his hand, and hissed at the head of security to intercept me. He actually thought he still had the power to command the room. A burly guard stepped into my path, his hand raised. I did not stop. I simply reached into my breast pocket and pulled out a lanyard containing a holographic ID card. It was my founder's shareholder credential, a card Julian had forgotten I still possessed. "I am the majority shareholder," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the sudden hush of the crowd. "Through the consolidation of outstanding debt and holding companies, I control 51% of the voting rights of this corporation. Get out of my way." The guard looked at the card, looked at the FBI agents behind me, and stepped aside. The crowd of investors parted like the Red Sea before Moses. I walked down the center aisle, the click of my heels echoing like gunshots in the silence. I kept my eyes locked on Julian. I did not blink. I wanted him to see the exact moment his world ended. Serena, desperate to save the narrative, rushed down from the side of the stage to block me. She looked ridiculous in her red dress, a splash of panic against the wave of justice coming for them, before she could open her mouth to spew another lie. My lead attorney stepped forward. He thrust his document into her chest. "Serena Kincaid, you are being served with a federal subpoena for insider trading and money laundering," he announced, loud enough for every microphone to catch. The cameras turned away from the stage and flashed in her face. She looked at the paper, then at me, her face crumbling from arrogance to absolute terror. I walked past her without breaking stride. I was not there for the mistress. I was there for the king. I stepped onto the stage, the heavy silence of the room amplifying the sound of my heartbeat, though my pulse remained terrifyingly steady. I did not reach for the microphone immediately. Instead, I walked past Julian, who stood frozen like a statue of a fallen dictator, and approached the presentation laptop. With a single fluid motion, I inserted a silver USB drive. I did not need a password. I had built the system, after all. The massive LED screen behind us, which had been displaying a graph of projected billions, flickered once. Then, the image changed. It was no longer a chart. It was a high-definition video, shaky but clear, taken from a hidden camera inside our dining room 3 months ago. On the screen, Julian was pacing, holding a glass of scotch, shouting at his reflection. "Just change the toxicity numbers," he said in the video, his voice booming through the auditorium speakers. "Nobody reads the appendix of a 400-page FDA submission. If the rats are dying, buy new rats." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It was a physical sound, a wave of shock that hit the stage. To my left, the real-time stock ticker for Ethereus Dynamics, displayed on a side monitor, began to bleed red. The numbers tumbled, wiping out $300 million of market cap in 10 seconds. Julian snapped out of his trance. He grabbed his microphone, his face turning a violent shade of purple. "This is a deep fake," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Do not listen to her. My wife is suffering from a severe mental breakdown. She is delusional. This is AI-generated sabotage." He was sticking to the script, desperate to gaslight a room full of the smartest financial minds in the country. I calmly reached over and took the microphone from the podium stand. He tried to grab it, but I stepped out of his reach. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am not crazy," I said, my voice cool and echoing off the walls. "I am the one who wrote the source code for the success of this company. And today, I am here to debug its biggest error, CEO Julian Thorne." I clicked a button on a remote presenter I had palmed. The screen changed again. This time, it displayed a patent document from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. "Everything you think Ethereus sells, every pill and every protocol, is based on this intellectual property," I continued. "And as you can see from the assignment history, Julian Thorne never legally acquired it, due to a decade-old clerical error he was too arrogant to fix. I still own the patent. Ethereus is not a unicorn. It is an empty shell selling stolen goods. That was the breaking point. Julian let out a feral growl and lunged at me. He raised his hand, intent on striking me right there in front of the world, but he never made contact. 2 FBI agents moved with blur-like speed, tackling him to the floor before his fingers could graze my jacket. The thud of his body hitting the stage was satisfyingly loud. I did not flinch. I looked down at him as he struggled against the handcuffs. Then I looked back at the audience. Furthermore, I said, pulling up the documents for the bad debt subsidiary, Mr. Thorne attempted to transfer the company's toxic debt and fraudulent liabilities into a shell corporation under my name. He forged my signature. The screen displayed a forensic handwriting analysis next to a biometric data log. This analysis proves the signature is a forgery, I explained. But this is not just white-collar crime. I pressed the play button one last time. The audio from the server room filled the hall. Julian's voice, distinct and cruel, discussed the brakes of my car and the winding roads near the cliffs. The words tragic accident hung in the air like smoke. The room went dead silent. The investors looked at Julian not as a failed businessman, but as a monster. I looked toward the side exit. Serena Kincaid was trying to slip out the fire escape, her red dress making her an easy target, but she could not move. The very reporters she had manipulated for years had formed a wall, their cameras flashing in her face, trapping her in the glare of the truth she had tried to bury. She was not leaving. Nobody was leaving until I said it was over. The chaos on the stage was a symphony of flashing lights and shouting voices, but for me, the world had slowed down to a single, crystalline moment of clarity. Julian was on his knees, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with the dust of the floor, his wrists bound behind him in stainless steel handcuffs. The image was being beamed live to millions of screens around the globe. He was still screaming my name, a desperate, guttural sound that swung wildly between rage and begging. He wanted me to tell them it was a mistake. He wanted the docile wife to step forward and fix the mess. I walked over to him, my heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. I signaled for the federal agents to pause for a second. I knelt down so our faces were level, invading his personal space just as he had invaded my life. I leaned close to his ear, smelling the sweat of his fear overpowering his cologne. You wanted a wife who never asked questions, who never demanded anything, and who never caused you any trouble, I whispered, my voice soft but deadly. Congratulations, Julian. You got exactly that woman, but in your arrogance, you forgot one critical thing. You forgot that before I was your wife. I was your accountant. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held the screen in front of his widening eyes. It displayed his primary offshore bank account balance. It read $0 and 0 cents. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. I continued, explaining the mechanics of his destruction with the patience of a teacher. You never read the fine print of our prenuptial agreement, did you? You were too busy counting your future billions. There is a clause on page 42 called the Business Ethics Stipulation. It states that if one party engages in felonious criminal activity that endangers the reputation of the joint assets, the other party retains the right to seize and liquidate all holdings to mitigate liability. I triggered it 10 minutes ago. Your money is gone. Julian. I transferred every penny to a blind trust dedicated to compensating the victims of your toxic medication. Behind him, I saw the flash of scarlet. Serena was being led away in handcuffs, flanked by 2 officers who looked bored by her hysterics. Her red dress, once a symbol of her power and her seduction, now looked cheap and garish against the gray uniforms of the police. She looked like a child playing dress-up at a funeral. She tried to catch my eye, perhaps to plead for mercy, but I looked through her as if she were made of glass. The members of the board of directors, men and women who had ignored me for years, suddenly rushed toward me. They were begging, their voices shrill with panic. They wanted me to stop the bleeding, to issue a statement that would stabilize the stock price, to save the company. I looked at them with cold detachment. No, I said firmly. Etheris must die so the truth can live. I handed a heavy briefcase to the lead agent from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Inside was everything: the hard drives, the physical ledgers, the recordings. By doing this, I was effectively setting fire to my own net worth. I was destroying the value of the shares I held, ensuring that I would walk away with a fraction of the fortune I could have claimed. But money is a renewable resource. Dignity is not. I turned back to Julian one last time as the agents hauled him up and dragged him toward the waiting police cruisers. He looked back at me, his eyes hollow, searching for a trace of the woman who had once loved him. He found nothing. There were no tears stinging my eyes. There was no lingering sadness in my heart. I felt only the profound, light-headed relief of a patient who has just woken up from surgery to find a malignant tumor has been successfully cut from their body. The doors to the hotel lobby burst open, and the humid Seattle air rushed in. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, immediately blinded by the strobe light effect of 1,000 camera flashes. The world wanted a statement. They wanted to see the grieving widow of a dead empire. Instead, I lifted my chin, looked directly into the lenses, and walked forward. I did not cover my face. I had nothing to hide. I stood outside the towering glass facade of the Obsidian Plaza. The wind coming off the Puget Sound was fierce, carrying the scent of salt and rain, whipping my hair across my face in tangled strands. For the first time in 5 years, the cold did not make me shiver. It felt like a baptism. The air scrubbed my skin clean, stripping away the layers of the billionaire's wife, the trophy, the victim. What remained standing on the concrete was just Ilara Vance. My phone vibrated against my thigh, a relentless, buzzing heartbeat. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a deluge. Major publishing houses were already emailing agents I did not have yet. Television networks were calling. Even the competitors who had spent the last decade trying to crush Etheris were now reaching out, leaving voicemails offering me the position of chief executive officer. They smelled power, and they wanted to buy it. I swiped the screen to silent and shoved the device back into my pocket. I would answer them on my own time, or perhaps never. I looked down at my left hand. The diamond solitaire on my ring finger was the size of a quail egg, catching the gray light of the Seattle afternoon. It looked magnificent, but like everything else in my marriage, it was a lie. Julian had pawned the real diamond 2 years ago to cover a massive gambling debt in Macau, replacing it with this high-grade cubic zirconia replica. He told me it was for insurance purposes, for my safety. I slid the cold metal off my finger. It felt heavy with 5 years of gaslighting. I walked over to a municipal trash can bolted to the sidewalk. I held the ring over the opening for a split second, watching it catch the light one last time. And then I dropped it. It made a hollow clink as it hit the bottom, landing among the discarded coffee cups and wet newspapers. A taxi pulled up to the curb, a battered yellow sedan that had seen better days. It was a stark contrast to the fleet of black limousines I was accustomed to, and it was absolutely perfect. The driver, a man with tired eyes and a kind face, rolled down the window and asked where I wanted to go. I did not give him the address of the penthouse. That cold mausoleum was no longer my home. Instead, I gave him the address of a small, nondescript office building in the quiet suburbs. It was a modest space I had rented 6 months ago under my maiden name, painted in soft colors, with a desk I had assembled myself. It was the headquarters of my new forensic financial consultancy firm. I settled into the cracked leather of the back seat as the car pulled away. I opened the banking application on my phone. I navigated past the frozen joint accounts and logged into the secure, encrypted account Julian never knew existed. The balance stared back at me, a string of numbers that represented safety. This was not money stolen from the company or hidden in an offshore haven. It was clean capital, earned through my own shrewd investments and market foresight over the last decade. It was enough to live freely for the rest of my life. I looked out the window at the passing city. I realized then that the sweetest revenge is not making your enemy scream. It is not about inflicting pain, though Julian was certainly in pain right now. The ultimate revenge is to become wildly, untouchably successful on the very ashes of the life they tried to burn down. A memory surfaced, unbidden but no longer painful. I heard the voice of my father, thick with cheap whiskey, echoing from the kitchen of my childhood home in Ohio. "You will never amount to anything, Ilara," he had sneered. "You are just like the rest of us." I smiled at the reflection in the window. I was not like him. I was not like Julian. I had broken the cycle. I had survived the poverty and the betrayal, and I had come out the other side not as a victim, but as a victor. As the taxi waited at a red light, a young reporter with a handheld camera spotted me. He rushed over, banging on the glass, breathless and desperate for a quote. I rolled the window down just 2 inches. He thrust his lens toward me, his eyes wide. I looked directly into the black circle of the camera, my expression calm and resolute. I offered him a small, enigmatic smile and spoke my final words to the world that Julian Thorne had built. "Read the fine print," I said softly. "It might save your life." I rolled the window up. The light turned green, and the taxi merged into the flow of traffic, becoming just another yellow dot in the river of cars. Behind me, the sirens wailed and the cameras flashed, a chaotic funeral for a toxic marriage. But ahead of me, the road was open. Ilara Vance finally belonged to herself. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today, so please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Ilara's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, hit the like button, and press the hype button to help this video reach more people. Your support means the world to me.